There are moments that split your life into before and after. For me, it was the sound of laughter coming from my bedroom on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of laughter that felt wrong. I turned the doorknob, not knowing that what I was about to see would destroy not just my marriage, but my entire family. The woman in my bed wasn't a stranger. She was the person I'd grown up calling my best friend, my cousin, the woman who stood beside me at my wedding. And now she was lying beside my husband. But what I discovered after I caught them, that betrayal was just the beginning of a story so twisted, it would take me 3 years to uncover the truth. A truth that would expose lies going back decades and reveal that everyone I loved had been playing a part in a conspiracy I never saw coming. This is a true story. Names have been changed to protect identities, but every word you're about to hear actually happened. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why the people closest to us are sometimes the most dangerous, and why trust, once broken, reveals truths we were never meant to find. Over the next hour, you'll discover how long this affair really been going on, who else in the family knew, and why they kept silent. What dark secret from my husband's past made him the perfect target, and why my cousin risked everything when she already had the one thing I never knew she wanted. You'll learn why the people we trust most can become our greatest betrayers, and how sometimes the life we think we're living is nothing more than an elaborate illusion constructed by those who claim to love us. This is the story of how I lost everything and found out who I really was. This is the story of how betrayal became my greatest teacher. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Emily Thompson. I'm 52 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I had it all figured out. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where your neighbors are at every birthday party, and where family dinners happen every Sunday without fail. I was the middle child of 3, sandwiched between my older brother Nathan and my younger sister Grace. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. My father worked at the local manufacturing plant for 35 years, and my mother was a stay-at-home mom who volunteered at the church and organized every community event you could imagine. We were what people called a good family, the kind that others looked up to, the kind that seemed to have everything together. I met my husband James when I was 28 years old. We were both in our late 20s, both ready to settle down, both looking for something stable after years of failed relationships and career struggles. James was handsome in an understated way, tall with kind eyes, and a smile that made you feel safe. He worked as a loan officer at the local bank, had just bought his first house, and seemed like exactly the kind of man my parents had always hoped I'd marry. Our courtship was simple and sweet. We dated for 2 years, got engaged on Christmas Eve in front of my entire family, and married 6 months later in the same church where my parents had married 30 years before. It was perfect, or at least that's what I thought. We built what I believed was a good life together. 2 years after we married, I gave birth to our daughter Charlotte. 3 years after that, our son Oliver was born. I worked as an elementary school teacher at the same school I had attended as a child, teaching second graders how to read and write and discover the world. James climbed the ranks at the bank, eventually becoming a senior loan officer, respected in the community, trusted by everyone who walked through those doors. We bought a 4-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, to the kind with sidewalks and tree-lined streets where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. We went to church on Sundays, hosted barbecues in the summer, and took family vacations to the same lake cabin every August. From the outside, we were living the American dream. But marriages are strange things, aren't they? They start with passion and promise, and somewhere along the way, without you even noticing, they can transform into something else entirely. Something comfortable but distant. Something safe but hollow. James and I stopped really talking somewhere around our 10th anniversary. Oh, we spoke plenty. We discussed grocery lists and soccer schedules, and who would pick up Oliver from practice. We coordinated calendars and paid bills and made decisions about home repairs. But we stopped talking about dreams, about fears, about the things that made us human. We stopped looking at each other with curiosity. We stopped asking how the other person really felt. We became roommates who shared a bed and a last name, going through the motions of marriage without the substance of partnership. I told myself this was normal. I told myself that all marriages go through phases, that the fire couldn't burn forever, that what we had was real even if it wasn't exciting. I looked at my parents, married for 40 years, sitting in their respective recliners every evening watching television in silence, and I thought that's just what happens. Love transforms. Passion becomes companionship. The butterflies die, but the commitment remains. I genuinely believed that James and I had reached that stage, that mature phase of marriage where you don't need fireworks because you have something deeper, something more meaningful. I was wrong about everything. And then there was Rachel. Rachel Hayes wasn't just my cousin. She was my person. We grew up 3 houses apart on the same street. Our mothers were sisters, and from the time we could walk, we were inseparable. Rachel was 2 years younger than me, which meant I was always the protective older cousin, the one who looked out for her, the one who defended her when other kids were mean, the one who shared everything I had because that's what family does. We spent every weekend together, every holiday, every summer vacation. We shared clothes and secrets and dreams. When we were teenagers, we promised each other we'd be at each other's weddings, that our children would grow up together, that we'd be 2 old ladies sitting on a porch someday laughing about all the memories we'd made. Rachel's childhood was harder than mine. Her father left when she was 6 years old, just disappeared one day and never came back. Her mother, my Aunt Margaret, struggled with depression for years afterward, leaving Rachel to essentially raise herself through much of her adolescence. She bounced between our house and hers, eating dinner with us more often than not, sleeping in my room on weekends, becoming less like a cousin and more like another sister. My parents treated her like their own daughter, helping her with homework, attending her school events, making sure she knew she was loved, even when her own home felt empty and sad. When Rachel's mother died of an overdose when Rachel was 16, there was never even a question about what would happen next. She moved in with us officially, took the bedroom that had been our guest room, and lived with my family for the next 2 years until she graduated from high school. Those were formative years for both of us. Rachel and I became even closer during that time, if such a thing was possible. I watched her grieve, held her when she cried, helped her process the complicated feelings of loving and resenting a mother who had been physically present but emotionally absent for so long. We talked late into the night about everything, about boys and college, and what we wanted our lives to look like. Rachel was brilliant, always smarter than me, always more creative, more passionate about everything she did. She wanted to be a therapist, ought to help people the way she wished someone had helped her mother. She wanted to understand the human mind, to figure out why people hurt each other, why they hurt themselves, why love and pain seem so intricately connected. We went to college together, roommates for all 4 years at Ohio State University. While I pursued my teaching degree, Rachel threw herself into psychology, devouring every book, every theory, every case study she could find. We had different friend groups, but always came back to each other, meeting for coffee between classes, studying together in the library, spending weekends exploring Columbus and dreaming about our futures. After graduation, we moved back home to the same small Ohio town where we'd grown up. I got my teaching job almost immediately. Rachel enrolled in a graduate program an hour away, driving back and forth while working part-time at a mental health clinic. We saw each other constantly, still best friends, still telling each other everything. And then I met James at my 30th birthday party, or at least that's what I always thought. My parents threw me a surprise party at their house, inviting everyone I'd ever known, and James was there as the +1 of one of my brother's friends. We hit it off immediately. He was charming and attentive, asking me questions about my work, laughing at my jokes, making me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. We exchanged numbers that night, went on our first date 3 days later, and fell into an easy, comfortable relationship that felt right from the beginning. 6 months later, he proposed. I was thrilled. My family was thrilled. And Rachel, my beloved cousin, my best friend, stood beside me as my maid of honor on the happiest day of my life, smiling and crying and telling me how happy she was for me. What I didn't know, what no one told me, what they all decided I was better off not knowing, was that James and Rachel had a history, not just any history, a serious, intense, all-consuming history that had nearly destroyed Rachel years before I ever entered the picture. They had dated for 2 years in high school, from the time James was 16 until he was 18. According to everyone who knew them back then, they were obsessed with each other. One of those teenage relationships that burn so hot and bright that everyone around them can feel the heat. They talked about getting married, about spending their lives together, about the future they would build as soon as they graduated. But then James left for college 3 hours away, and Rachel stayed behind to finish her senior year of high school. The distance was too much. James met new people, experienced new things, and slowly began to pull away. By Christmas of that year, he broke up with Rachel over the phone, telling her he needed to focus on school, that they were too young to be so serious, that she should move on and find someone else. Rachel was devastated. According to my brother Nathan, who only told me this years later, Rachel's reaction was severe. She stopped eating, stopped going to school, stopped functioning entirely. She told everyone she wanted to die, that life without James wasn't worth living. My Aunt Margaret, already fragile herself, didn't know how to help. Rachel ended up being hospitalized for 3 months. though at the time I was told it was for complications from pneumonia. Just another lie in a long chain of lies that everyone agreed to tell to protect me from truths they decided I couldn't handle. When Rachel came back home, she was different, quieter, more withdrawn. She threw herself into her studies, graduated high school with honors despite missing so much of her senior year, and left for college with what seemed like a determination to start over. James moved on as well, dating other people, finishing his degree, starting his career. By the time I met him 12 years later, he was 30 years old, settled, seemingly past whatever wild phase he'd gone through in his youth. And Rachel? She had built a life, too. She'd earned her master's degree in clinical psychology, was working toward her license. She was in a serious relationship with a man named Andrew who worked in IT. She seemed happy, stable, healed. So when I introduced James to Rachel at my birthday party, when I watched them shake hands and exchange pleasantries like strangers meeting for the first time, I had no idea I was watching a performance. I had no idea that they had already seen each other across the room, that they had already locked eyes, that something had passed between them that I was too naive to recognize. I had no idea that my entire family, my parents, my brother, my sister, even some of my aunts and uncles, all knew exactly who James was the moment they saw him standing in our living room with his arm around my waist, and not a single one of them said a word. My mother would later tell me they made a decision that night, all of them together, to keep the past buried. James had clearly moved on, they reasoned. Rachel seemed happy with Andrew. Why dredge up ancient history that would only hurt me and possibly ruin what looked like a good relationship? Why tell me that my new boyfriend was my cousin's first love, the man who had once broken her so badly she'd needed to be hospitalized? What good would it do? Better to let sleeping dogs lie. Better to let me be happy. Better to protect me from information that might make me question everything. So they all agreed, every single person who knew, to pretend they were meeting James for the first time, to act surprised when he and I got engaged, to smile and celebrate and never breathe a word of the truth. And Rachel played her part beautifully. She welcomed James into the family with open arms. She complimented my ring. She helped plan my bridal shower. She stood beside me at the altar and handed me my bouquet and watched me marry the man she had once loved with every fiber of her being. Looking back at the wedding photos now, knowing what I know, I can see it in her face. The tightness around her eyes, the forced quality of her smile, the way she's looking at James in the background of one photo, her expression unreadable, but certainly not joyful. But at the time, I saw none of it. I was too busy being a bride, too consumed with my own happiness to notice anyone else's pain. The years passed. James and I settled into married life, had our babies, built our routines. Rachel broke up with Andrew after a few years, saying they wanted different things. She got her clinical license and opened a private therapy practice, building a reputation as someone who was especially good at helping people through relationship trauma and complicated family dynamics. The irony of that specialization would only become clear to me much later. She dated occasionally, but never seriously, always saying she was too focused on her career to settle down, that she was happy being independent, that she'd find the right person when the time was right. We all accepted this explanation. Why wouldn't we? Rachel seemed content with her life, She was around constantly, a fixture at every family gathering, every birthday, every holiday. She was Charlotte's godmother, present at the hospital when I gave birth, holding my daughter before anyone else outside of James and me. She babysat regularly, took the kids on special outings, spoiled them with gifts and attention. And James and Rachel got along well, but not too well, nothing that raised any red flags. They joked and chatted at family events, but rarely spent time alone together. He called her his favorite cousin-in-law. She called him a good guy who made me happy. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed fine. Everything was a carefully constructed illusion that would take me years to see through. Rachel went through 2 marriages in the span of 10 years, both ending in divorce. The first husband, William, was a high school teacher she married when she was 35. That marriage lasted 3 years before he filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Rachel told us he was controlling, that he didn't respect her career, that the marriage had been a mistake from the start. We rallied around her, supported her. They helped her move into a new apartment. The second husband, Benjamin, was a contractor she married at 39. That marriage lasted even less time, barely 18 months, before it imploded. Again, Rachel had explanations. He had anger issues. He didn't want children, and she did. They brought out the worst in each other. Again, we believed her. Why wouldn't we? She was family. She was one of us. We trusted her completely. What I didn't know, what none of us knew at the time, was that both marriages had ended because of affairs. William discovered text messages on Rachel's phone between her and a married man she'd been seeing for months. Benjamin came home early from a job one day to find Rachel in bed with one of his business partners. Both men filed for divorce immediately, both citing adultery, but Rachel managed to keep the details quiet, settling out of court, spinning narratives that painted her as the victim rather than the villain. She was good at that, I would learn, good at rewriting history, good at making herself the wronged party in every story, good at manipulation in ways that most people never saw until it was too late. 5 years ago, Rachel hit what she called rock bottom. Her second divorce had left her financially strained. Her therapy practice was struggling because word had gotten around about the affair with Benjamin's business partner, and in a small town, reputation is everything. She started drinking heavily, missing appointments, showing up to family events with slurred speech and glassy eyes. We were all worried about her. I was especially worried about her. She was my person, my family. The woman I'd known my entire life. I couldn't stand watching her fall apart. So I did what I'd always done. I helped her. James and I offered to let Rachel stay with us while she got back on her feet. She refused at first, proud and stubborn, but eventually accepted when we told her it would only be temporary, just until she could rebuild her practice and stabilize her finances. She moved into our guest room, the same room she'd lived in during high school when my parents had taken her in, history repeating itself. She started attending AA meetings. She cut back her client load to focus on healing. She spent hours with Charlotte and Oliver, forming even closer bonds with my children, becoming less like an aunt and more like a third parent. She helped with homework and drove carpool and cooked dinner. She made herself indispensable. And slowly, subtly, in ways I couldn't see at the time, She started inserting herself into every corner of our lives. She and James started having long conversations about her recovery, about the challenges she was facing, about the mistakes she'd made in her past relationships. He became her confidant, her supporter, someone she could talk to when things got hard. I encouraged this. I thought it was good that they were bonding, that James was being supportive of my cousin during such a difficult time. I thought it meant we were a strong family, that we could weather any storm together. I had no idea I was watching the beginning of a betrayal so profound it would eventually destroy everything I'd built. Rachel lived with us for 6 months before moving into an apartment we helped her find, on a small one-bedroom place 10 minutes from our house. Even after she moved out, she was around constantly. She came for dinner 3 or 4 times a week. She joined us for movie nights and weekend outings. She borrowed our car when hers was in the shop. She had a key to our house so she could come and go as she pleased, feeding our cat when we were out of town, watering the plants, making herself at home in a space that I genuinely thought of as our shared space, because she was family and family doesn't need boundaries. Looking back now with the clarity that only comes from having your entire world shattered, I can see so many signs I missed. The way James started working late more frequently, always with plausible excuses about closing big loans or meeting with difficult clients. The way Rachel started looking different, losing weight, dressing more carefully, wearing makeup more often even when she wasn't seeing clients. The inside jokes between them that I didn't quite understand. The times I'd walk into a room and they'd both go quiet for just a second before resuming whatever conversation I'd interrupted. The way James's phone was suddenly always face down on the table, password protected even though it hadn't been before. The way Rachel seemed to know details about James's work that I didn't know, commenting on clients or situations he'd apparently told her about, but never mentioned to me. But I didn't see it. Or maybe I saw it and chose not to process it, chose not to let myself follow those threads to their logical conclusion. Because to do so would mean questioning everything, would mean doubting the 2 people I trusted most in the world. Would mean entertaining thoughts so painful and impossible that my brain simply refused to go there. So I explained everything away. James was stressed at work. Rachel was working hard on her recovery and self-improvement. They had developed a close friendship because they'd both been there for her during her darkest time. There was nothing unusual happening. There was nothing to worry about. Everything was fine. Until March 17th, 2022, the day that split my life into before and after. The day everything I thought I knew revealed itself to be nothing more than a carefully maintained fiction. The day I stopped being naive and started seeing the truth. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for how it would end. I woke up with a migraine, one of those blinding headaches that makes light feel like knives and sound feel like hammers. I made it through the morning at school, teaching through the pain. But by lunch, I knew I couldn't finish the day. I called the school office, arranged for a substitute to cover my afternoon classes, and drove home at 1:30 in the afternoon, 3 hours earlier than usual. I pulled into our driveway expecting an empty house. James had told me that morning he'd be working until 6. Something about back-to-back client meetings and paperwork that needed to be filed by end of day. But his truck was in the driveway. my first thought was that he'd come home sick too, that maybe whatever was giving me a migraine had affected him as well. But then I noticed Rachel's car parked down the street, not directly in front of our house, but a few houses down, partially hidden behind the neighbor's hedge. That was odd. If Rachel was visiting, why wouldn't she park in the driveway like she always did? Why hide her car? A sick feeling started building in my stomach, though I couldn't have articulated why. I got out of my car slowly, my migraine momentarily forgotten, replaced by something else, some primal instinct that was screaming at me that something was very wrong. I walked to the front door, unlocked it, stepped inside. The house was silent, no television, no music, no voices, just an eerie quiet that felt heavy and wrong. I stood in the entryway for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, listening, trying to understand what I was sensing. And then I heard it. Laughter, muffled but unmistakable, coming from upstairs. I'm from the direction of our bedroom. James's laugh, warm and genuine, the kind of laugh I realized with a jolt. I hadn't heard from him in years, at least not directed at me. And another laugh, feminine, light, Rachel's laugh, coming from my bedroom at 2:00 on a Tuesday afternoon, when James was supposed to be at work, when Rachel's car was hidden down the street. My hands started shaking. My heart started racing. Every instinct I had was telling me to leave, to get back in my car, to drive away and pretend I'd never come home early. But I couldn't. I had to know. I had to see. I had to confirm what my body already understood, but my mind was still refusing to accept. I walked up the stairs slowly, each step feeling like it took an eternity. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I could feel sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the coolness of the house. I reached the top of the stairs and turned down the hallway toward our bedroom. The door was closed but not locked. Through it, I could hear voices now, not just laughter. Low murmurs, intimate tones, the rustle of fabric, sounds that shouldn't have been coming from my bedroom in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. I stood outside that door for what felt like forever, my hand hovering over the doorknob, giving myself one last chance to turn around, to preserve my ignorance, to keep my world intact. But I couldn't. I turned the knob. I pushed the door open, and I saw them. They were in my bed, under the quilt my grandmother had made for James and me as a wedding gift, a quilt that had covered us for 24 years, that had been there for every milestone, every quiet moment, every vulnerable night. They were naked, wrapped around each other. Rachel's head was on James's chest. His arm was around her shoulders. They looked comfortable. They looked practiced. They looked like they'd done this 1,000 times before. And for a moment, just a brief moment before they noticed me standing in the doorway, I saw something on both their faces that broke me more than the physical betrayal. They looked happy. They looked peaceful. They looked like people who had finally found what they'd been searching for. Rachel saw me first. Her eyes met mine over James's shoulder, and I waited for horror, for shame, for guilt. But what I saw instead was something I didn't expect: defiance. Her eyes held mine steadily. No tears, no panic, just a cold certainty that made my blood run cold. And then she spoke. 5 words that would echo in my mind for years to come. 5 words that revealed depths of betrayal I hadn't begun to fathom. 5 words that turned my entire understanding of my life into a lie. She said he was always mine first. He was always mine first. Not I'm sorry. Not this isn't what it looks like. Not please let me explain. Just he was always mine first, as if those 5 words justified everything, as if they erased 24 years of marriage, as if they explained why she was in my bed with my husband on a Tuesday afternoon, with her car hidden down the street like a guilty secret. James scrambled up then, grabbing for clothes, stammering excuses that sounded hollow even as they left his mouth. This isn't what you think. It's not what it looks like. We didn't mean for this to happen. I was going to tell you on all the classic lines that mean nothing, that change nothing, that are just words people say when they've been caught doing something unforgivable. But Rachel, she didn't scramble. She didn't rush. She got out of bed slowly, deliberately, pulling on her clothes with a calmness that felt more obscene than the nudity itself. She looked at me the entire time, her expression unreadable, and then she walked past me out of the bedroom without saying another word. I heard her footsteps on the stairs. I heard the front door open and close. I heard her car start and drive away, and I stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to process what had just happened in the space I'd shared with my husband for over 2 decades. James was still talking, a stream of words that I couldn't make sense of. Explanations and justifications and pleas that all blurred together into meaningless noise. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized I didn't know this man at all. The person I'd shared my life with, raised children with, built a home with, was a stranger. Someone capable of betrayal so profound I didn't have words for it. Someone who could lie to my face every single day. Someone who could sleep beside me at night after having been with my cousin during the day. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I felt too numb for any of that. I just stood there, staring at this stranger wearing my husband's face, and I said very quietly, "I want you to leave." He didn't leave that night. He couldn't. We had children in the house, children who would be home from school in 2 hours, children who didn't need to see their father being thrown out without understanding why. So instead, I left. I grabbed my purse, got back in my car, and drove. I don't even remember where I went. I just drove through neighborhoods I'd known my entire life. Streets that suddenly felt foreign and unfamiliar, as if the entire world had shifted on its axis, and nothing was where it was supposed to be anymore. Eventually, I found myself parked in front of my brother Nathan's house. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself get out of the car and knock on his door. Nathan took one look at my face and knew something catastrophic had happened. He pulled me inside, sat me down on his couch, and waited. I told him everything. I described coming home early, hearing the laughter, opening the bedroom door, seeing them together. I told him about Rachel's words. He was always mine first, and how those 5 words had made no sense to me, how they had felt like a riddle I couldn't solve. And then I watched my brother's face change. I watched guilt and resignation wash over his features, and I knew. I knew before he said a single word that Nathan had been keeping secrets too. What my brother told me next would shatter every remaining piece of my understanding of my life. He told me about James and Rachel's relationship in high school, about how they dated for 2 years, about how deeply in love they'd been. He told me about the breakup, about Rachel's breakdown, about the hospitalization that I'd been told was pneumonia, but was actually a psychiatric hold because she'd tried to hurt herself. He told me that everyone in the family had known who James was, the moment they saw him at my 30th birthday party. He told me about the family meeting that had happened without me, the decision they'd all made to keep the past buried, to let me be happy in my ignorance. I sat there listening to Nathan's confession, and I felt something inside me break that had nothing to do with James's betrayal. This was different. This was my entire family, people I'd trusted my whole life, people who were supposed to protect me, and they had all conspired to keep me in the dark about something that fundamentally affected my life. They had watched me fall in love with a man who had a history with my cousin. They had watched me plan a wedding, walk down an aisle, speak vows, build a life, have children, all while knowing something I didn't know. And they had stolen my right to make an informed choice about my own life. And they had done it, Nathan said with tears in his eyes, because they loved me and wanted to protect me. But I didn't feel protected. I felt betrayed. Again, differently, more deeply. Because while I could understand on some level how an affair might happen, how people might fall back into old patterns, how emotions might override judgment, I could not understand how an entire family could look at me every single day for 24 years and maintain such a massive deception. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday gathering, every casual conversation where Rachel and James were mentioned in the same breath. Everyone knew, everyone lied. Everyone thought they were doing the right thing by keeping me ignorant of my own life. Nathan told me he'd wanted to say something so many times. He said there were moments, especially in the early years of my marriage, when he'd almost told me the truth. But our mother had made everyone promise. She'd said that telling me would only hurt me for no reason, that the past was the past, that James had clearly moved on and Rachel had too, and dredging up old history would potentially destroy my marriage for something that was long over. So Nathan had kept his promise to our mother. They all had. And now, sitting in his living room 24 years later, he was asking me to forgive him for a lie that had lasted longer than some marriages. I couldn't do it. Not then. Maybe not ever. I left Nathan's house feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my entire life. My husband had betrayed me with my cousin. My cousin, my best friend, had been sleeping with my husband while looking me in the eye and pretending everything was normal. My entire family had lied to me for decades. Who could I trust? Where could I turn? Everything I'd believed about my life, about my relationships, about the people I loved, had been revealed as false. I drove home slowly, dreading what I would find when I got there, dreading the conversation I would have to have, dreading the moment when I would have to look at my children and figure out how to explain that their family was about to fall apart. James was waiting for me when I got home. Charlotte and Oliver were in their rooms doing homework, unaware that anything was wrong. He asked if we could talk. I said yes, because what else was I going to say? We sat at the kitchen table, on the same table where we'd eaten thousands of meals, where we'd helped the kids with homework, where we'd paid bills and planned vacations and lived our ordinary life. And James told me the truth. Finally. After 24 years of marriage and apparently years of lying, he told me the truth. He confirmed everything Nathan had told me. He and Rachel had dated in high school. They'd been each other's first love, first everything. When he'd broken up with her to go to college, he genuinely thought it was the right decision. They were young. They needed to experience life. They needed to grow up separately before they could know if what they had was real or just teenage intensity. But Rachel hadn't seen it that way. She'd fallen apart. And James, away at college, had tried to move on, had dated other people, had built a new life. And by the time he met me 12 years later, he swore he'd moved on completely. Rachel was his past. I was his future. But then at my birthday party, he'd seen her again, and something had shifted. Not immediately, not even consciously at first. But there was a pull, he said, a recognition, a feeling of unfinished business that he didn't know how to name or what to do with. Still, he'd married me. He'd built a life with me. He'd been, by all accounts, a faithful husband for 20 years. 20 years of marriage where he never strayed, never even thought about straying. 20 years where he genuinely believed he'd made the right choice, that he loved me, that we had something real and good. And then Rachel had come back into our lives 5 years ago, broken, vulnerable, needing help. And James had started spending time with her, or talking to her, supporting her through her recovery. And slowly, gradually, without either of them meaning for it to happen, he said old feelings had resurfaced. They'd started having deeper conversations. They'd started remembering what they'd once meant to each other. They'd started wondering what might have been if things had gone differently all those years ago. And then, one night, about 3 years ago, they'd crossed a line they could never uncross. 3 years. I sat there absorbing that information. 3 years they'd been having an affair. 3 years of lies and deception and betrayal. 3 years of James coming home to me after being with her, kissing me goodnight after spending the afternoon in her bed, sitting across from me at dinner while planning his next meeting with her. 3 years of Rachel showing up at family gatherings, hugging me, laughing with me, playing with my children, all while carrying on a relationship with my husband. 3 years of everyone around me living in truth while I lived in delusion. I asked James why. Why did he stay married to me if he was in love with Rachel? Why did he keep up the charade? Why not just leave and be with the person he apparently wanted to be with? His answer was complicated and painful, and somehow made everything worse. He said he loved us both. He loved me as the mother of his children, as his partner, as the person he'd built a life with. But he was in love with Rachel. She was his soulmate, he said, using a word that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. They had a connection he couldn't explain, couldn't resist, couldn't give up. But he also couldn't bear the thought of destroying our family, of hurting Charlotte and Oliver, of blowing up the life we'd created together. So he'd tried to have both. He'd tried to maintain his marriage while conducting his affair. He'd tried to be a good father and a good husband while also being Rachel's partner in secret. He'd convinced himself, he said, that this arrangement could work, that as long as I didn't know, as long as the children didn't know, no one was really getting hurt. He'd convinced himself that what I didn't know couldn't hurt me, that his feelings for Rachel didn't diminish what he felt for me, that he could love 2 women in 2 different ways and keep everyone happy. He'd convinced himself of a lot of things that were clearly, obviously, painfully untrue. I asked him if he'd planned to ever tell me. He said no. He said he and Rachel had talked about it many times, about leaving our respective lives and being together openly. But they'd always concluded it would cause too much damage, hurt too many people, destroy too many relationships. So they decided to continue as they were, to take what they could get, to be together in secret for as long as they could manage it. They decided, without any input from me, that I was better off not knowing. They decided that their happiness was worth my ignorance. They decided that I didn't deserve the truth. Except Rachel hadn't been entirely happy with that arrangement, James admitted. She wanted more. She wanted him to leave me. She wanted them to be together publicly, to stop hiding, to build a real life together instead of stealing moments in secret. She'd been pressuring him for months to make a choice, to pick her, to stop trying to have everything and instead choose the one thing that mattered, the affair, their love, their future. She'd given him an ultimatum, he said. Choose me or choose her. Make a decision by the end of the month, or she would make it for him by telling me everything herself. That's why her car had been hidden down the street that afternoon. That's why they'd been in our bed in the middle of the day. They'd been having a fight about his indecision, about his inability to leave me, about his continued insistence that he needed more time. Rachel had told him she was done waiting. She'd told him that if he couldn't choose her after 3 years, he never would. She'd told him that she deserved better than being someone's secret. That she'd wasted enough of her life waiting for James to be ready, that she was going to tell me everything, whether he liked it or not. And James, according to his version of events, had been trying to calm her down, to convince her to give him just a little more time, when I'd walked in and made the decision for both of them. I sat there listening to all of this, trying to process information that felt surreal and devastating, and somehow still not entirely real. My husband of 24 years had been having an affair with my cousin for 3 years. My cousin, my best friend, the woman I'd trusted more than almost anyone, had been sleeping with my husband while pretending to care about me. They'd been conducting this affair in my home, in my bed, or under my roof while I was at work teaching children their ABCs and thinking my life was normal. And now James was sitting across from me explaining it all, as if any of it made sense, as if any of it could be justified, as if there were magic words that could make me understand how 2 people I loved could betray me so completely. I asked him the question that had been burning in my mind since Rachel had spoken those 5 words in my bedroom. What did she mean when she said he was always mine first? James looked down at his hands. He took a long breath. And then he told me something that made every other revelation feel small in comparison. He told me that Rachel had orchestrated our meeting at my 30th birthday party. She'd found out through mutual friends that James was single, living back in the area, working at the bank. She'd called him before the party and asked him to come. She'd told him she wanted to see him again, to reconnect, to talk about old times. James had agreed, curious about seeing his first love after so many years apart, not knowing that Rachel had an agenda beyond simple nostalgia. Rachel's plan, James explained, had been to get him back. She'd spent the years since their breakup trying to move on, but never really succeeding. Every relationship she'd had, every man she'd dated or married, had been measured against James and found wanting. She'd never stopped loving him. She'd never stopped hoping that somehow, someday, they'd find their way back to each other. So when she'd heard he was single and back in town, she'd seen it as fate, as a second chance, as the universe giving her what she'd always wanted. She'd planned to talk to him at the party, to reignite their connection, to make him remember what they'd once had. But then something had gone wrong with Rachel's plan. James and I had met first. We'd started talking before he'd even seen Rachel across the room. We'd hit it off immediately, exchanging numbers before he'd had a chance to seek Rachel out. By the time Rachel had approached him later in the evening, James had already become interested in me. He'd told Rachel he'd met someone, that he thought there might be potential there, that he was going to ask me out. Rachel had been devastated, James said. She'd tried to tell him who I was, that I was her cousin, that this was complicated, that he should reconsider. But James had already made up his mind. He'd liked me. He'd wanted to pursue things with me. And Rachel, not wanting to reveal their history and ruin her relationship with me, had kept silent. So that's what Rachel had meant when she'd said he was always mine first. She'd found him first. She'd brought him to that party. She'd been trying to get him back when I'd accidentally intercepted him. In her mind, I'd stolen him. I'd taken what was rightfully hers. I'd built a life with a man who should have been hers. And for 24 years, she'd watched me live the life she believed she deserved, watched me have his children, watched me share his name, all while knowing that she'd loved him first, longer, more intensely. In her twisted logic, the affair wasn't betrayal. It was reclamation. It was taking back what I'd stolen from her, even though I'd had no idea I was taking anything. This information changed something in me. Up until that moment, I'd been devastated but also confused. I'd been trying to understand how Rachel could do this to me, how she could betray me so completely, when I'd been nothing but good to her my entire life. But now I understood. She didn't see herself as betraying me. She saw herself as the victim of my unintentional theft. She saw me as the other woman who'd gotten in the way of true love. She saw our entire relationship through this lens of resentment and entitlement that I'd never known existed. Every kind thing I'd ever done for her, every way I'd helped her, every moment of our friendship had been tainted by her secret belief that I owed her, that I'd taken something from her, that she had every right to take it back. I told James to leave, not just the room, the house. I told him to pack a bag and go stay somewhere else because I couldn't look at him anymore, couldn't breathe the same air, couldn't pretend for one more second that we were a married couple having a difficult conversation instead of two strangers who'd been living a lie for decades. He tried to argue. He said we needed to think about Charlotte and Oliver, needed to present a united front, needed to figure out how to handle this as parents, even if we couldn't handle it as spouses. But I was beyond caring about presenting any kind of front. I wanted him gone. I needed him gone. I needed space to think, to process, to figure out what came next without him sitting across from me, trying to explain the inexplicable. James left. He packed a bag and drove to his parents' house, which was its own kind of irony since his parents had apparently known about his history with Rachel all along and had also never said a word. Everyone had secrets. Everyone had lied. Everyone had participated in creating the elaborate fiction that was my life. I waited until James was gone before I went upstairs to tell Charlotte and Oliver that their father would be staying somewhere else for a while. I kept it vague, age-appropriate, not wanting to burden them with adult problems they shouldn't have to carry. Charlotte, 21 and home from college for the summer, looked at me with knowing eyes that suggested she suspected more than I was saying. Oliver, 19 and about to start his sophomore year, just nodded and asked if he could go back to his video game. Kids are resilient in ways that break your heart. After the kids were settled, I did something I'd never done before. I called the school and told them I needed to take a leave of absence for personal reasons. I'd been teaching for 24 years and had never taken more than the occasional sick day. I had months of unused vacation and personal time stored up. They were understanding, concerned, asking if everything was okay. I lied and said yes, everything was fine. I just needed some time to deal with a family situation. Another lie to add to the mountain of lies that had become my life. But this one was mine. This one I controlled. This one served me instead of serving everyone else. Then I did something else I'd never done. I hired a divorce lawyer, not just any lawyer. I did research. I read reviews. I called around until I found someone with a reputation for being aggressive or thorough and successful. Her name was Patricia Reynolds, and she'd been practicing family law for 30 years. I met with her the next day, told her everything, held nothing back. She listened without judgment, took notes, asked clarifying questions, and then told me something that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. She told me that before I did anything else, before I confronted Rachel, before I talked to my family, before I made any decisions about my marriage, I needed to document everything. Patricia explained that in a divorce, especially one involving adultery, documentation was everything. She told me to go through James's phone records, credit card statements, bank accounts, anything I could access that might provide evidence of the affair. She told me to save text messages, emails, receipts, and anything that proved what had been happening and for how long. She told me that Ohio was an equitable distribution state, which meant that marital property would be divided fairly but not necessarily equally, and that evidence of adultery and financial infidelity could significantly impact the settlement. She told me not to let emotion drive my decisions, but instead to be strategic, methodical, and thorough in building my case. So that's what I did. I spent the next week becoming a detective in my own life. I went through every financial record I could access. I looked at credit card statements going back 3 years. I found hotel charges, restaurant bills, purchases at stores I'd never been to. I found payments to a storage unit I'd never known existed. I called the storage facility. I used my name and James's account number from the credit card statement and convinced them to let me access the unit. Inside, I found more evidence than I'd ever wanted. Gifts James had bought for Rachel that he'd been storing until he could give them to her privately. Love letters they'd written to each other. Photographs of them together, smiling and happy, looking like a couple in love. A whole secret life documented and preserved in a climate-controlled storage unit that cost us $60 a month from our joint checking account. I photographed everything. I made copies of financial records. I forwarded emails from James's computer to my own account before he could think to delete them. I went through his phone one night when he came back to the house to get more clothes and left it on the kitchen counter while he went upstairs. Thousands of text messages between him and Rachel, going back years, explicit and emotional and damning. I forwarded the most relevant ones to myself, then deleted the evidence that I'd done so. I was methodical. I was thorough. I was everything Patricia had told me to be, And then I found something that changed everything again. Something that made me realize the affair wasn't just an emotional betrayal, but also a financial one. James had been giving Rachel money, a lot of money. Over the course of 3 years, he'd transferred more than $40,000 from our joint accounts into Rachel's bank account. Small amounts at first, a few hundred here and there, helping her pay rent or cover bills when her practice was struggling. But then larger amounts, $2,000, $5,000, $10,000 at a time. Money that should have been going toward our mortgage, our retirement, our children's college funds. Money that James had stolen from our family to support his mistress. But it got worse. I found credit card applications in my name that I'd never filled out. Cards with thousands of dollars in charges that I knew nothing about. James had forged my signature on the applications, used my information to open accounts, and then used those accounts to fund his affair with Rachel. Dinners at expensive restaurants, weekend getaways to hotels, gifts and trips and experiences that he'd paid for using credit in my name without my knowledge or consent. This wasn't just adultery. This was identity theft. This was fraud. This was a crime. I took all of this information to Patricia. She looked through everything I'd gathered, her expression growing more serious with each document she reviewed. Then she looked at me and said I had a decision to make. I could file for divorce based on adultery and seek a favorable settlement, or I could file a police report for identity theft and fraud, which would result in criminal charges against James. The two weren't mutually exclusive, she explained. I could do both, but I needed to understand that pressing criminal charges would make everything public, would potentially result in James losing his job, would impact our children in ways that a simple divorce might not. She asked me what I wanted to do. I didn't know. I went home and sat with that question for days. What did I want? Did I want revenge? Did I want justice? Did I want to destroy James the way he destroyed me? Or did I want to take the high road, to handle this quietly, protect our children from the worst of it? I thought about Charlotte and Oliver, both young adults now, but still my babies, still people who would be impacted by whatever decisions I made. I thought about the fact that if James went to jail or lost his job, it would affect his ability to pay child support or contribute to college expenses. I thought about the reality that punishing him might also punish them. But then I thought about Rachel. I thought about her standing in my bedroom telling me he was always mine first, with no remorse, no shame, no acknowledgement that she'd done anything wrong. I thought about 3 years of lies and manipulation. I thought about her using my children, bonding with them, becoming important in their lives, all while sleeping with their father. I thought about her at family gatherings, hugging me, acting like she cared about me, all while planning her next secret meeting with my husband. And I thought about the fact that if I just quietly divorced James and went away, Rachel would get exactly what she wanted. She'd get James without consequences. She'd get to play the victim, the woman who finally got her true love after years of waiting. She'd get to rewrite history as a love story instead of the sordid affair it actually was. That's when I realized I wasn't going to make this easy for either of them. I wasn't going to be the quiet, dignified wife who disappeared gracefully so they could ride off into the sunset together. I was going to fight. I was going to use every piece of evidence I had. I was going to make sure there were consequences for what they'd done. not because I was vindictive, though I won't pretend some part of me wasn't, but because I deserved better than to be treated like a placeholder in someone else's love story. I deserved better than to have my life savings stolen to fund someone else's affair. I deserved justice, and I was going to get it. I went back to Patricia and told her I wanted to do everything: file for divorce, file criminal charges, make everything public, use every legal tool available to protect myself and my assets and my future. She nodded and got to work. Within a week, James was served with divorce papers at the bank where he worked. Within 2 weeks, police showed up at his parents' house, where he was staying, to question him about the fraudulent credit cards. Within a month, he'd been arrested for identity theft and forgery, criminal charges that carried real prison time if convicted. The news spread through our small Ohio town like wildfire. People we'd known for decades suddenly had opinions about our marriage, about the affair, about everything. Some people were sympathetic to me, supportive, offering help and kind words. Others seemed to think there must be more to the story, that I must have done something to drive James into Rachel's arms, that good men don't cheat without reason. The speculation was endless and exhausting, but I held my head high. I went about my business. I focused on my children and my case, and rebuilding a life that felt like mine instead of like something that had been constructed for me, based on other people's lies. And then I dealt with Rachel. I hadn't spoken to her since the day I'd caught them together. She tried to call me several times, sent text messages that I'd ignored, even showed up at my house once, though I hadn't answered the door. But now I needed to confront her, not for her sake, but for mine. I needed to look her in the eye and tell her exactly what I thought of her, what she'd done, what she destroyed. I needed her to understand that she hadn't won anything, that taking my husband hadn't given her the fairy tale ending she thought she deserved. I called her and asked her to meet me at a coffee shop in the next town over, somewhere we wouldn't run into people we knew, somewhere neutral and public. She agreed immediately, probably hoping I was ready to forgive her, or at least to hear her side of the story. She was wrong on both counts. When she walked into that coffee shop, she looked different than I remembered, thinner, so more carefully dressed, her hair and makeup done in a way that suggested she'd been putting more effort into her appearance lately. She'd been getting ready to be James's girlfriend publicly, I realized. She'd been preparing to step into the role of his partner now that I was presumably out of the picture. We sat down across from each other. Rachel started to speak, started to explain, started to tell me her version of events. But I cut her off. I told her I didn't want to hear it. I told her I didn't care about her justifications or her feelings or her version of history. I told her that what she'd done was unforgivable, that sleeping with my husband while pretending to be my friend was the deepest betrayal I could imagine, that using my children and infiltrating my family to get close to James was manipulative and cruel. I told her that I didn't care that she'd loved him first, that dating someone as a teenager didn't give you lifetime ownership rights, that she'd had opportunities to tell me the truth and had chosen deception at every turn. And then I told her about the criminal charges. I told her about the fraud, about the forged credit card applications, about the $40,000 James had stolen from our family to give to her. I watched her face change as she realized the implications. I explained that as someone who had received stolen money, who had benefited from fraudulent financial transactions, she could potentially be charged as an accessory, or at minimum be required to return the money in a civil lawsuit. I told her that her therapy license, already on shaky ground because of her past ethical violations, would likely be reviewed again if criminal charges were filed against her. I told her that her reputation, her career, her entire life could be destroyed by what she'd participated in. Rachel went pale. She started stammering, trying to explain that she hadn't known about the fraud, that she'd thought James was giving her money from his own accounts, that she'd never asked him to commit crimes on her behalf. Maybe that was true. Maybe she really hadn't known. But I didn't care. She'd known she was sleeping with a married man. She'd known she was betraying her cousin. She'd known she was helping to destroy a family. Whether or not she'd known the specific details of where the money came from seemed like a minor point compared to the massive moral failures she'd already committed. I told Rachel that I'd already spoken to a lawyer about pursuing charges against her for receiving stolen funds. I told her that I'd documented every transfer, every gift, every dollar that James had given her that had come from accounts with my name on them. I told her that while I couldn't control what happened to James, I could absolutely make sure she faced consequences for her role in all of this. And then I told her what would make those consequences go away. I told her I wanted her to leave town, pack up her practice, sell her apartment, move somewhere far away where I'd never have to see her face again. I told her I wanted her to stay away from my children, never contact them, never try to explain herself to them, or maintain the relationship she'd built with them through lies and manipulation. Or I told her I wanted her gone from my life completely and permanently. Rachel looked at me with something like shock. She said I couldn't force her to leave, that she had a right to live wherever she wanted, that I couldn't dictate her life choices. I smiled at her, not a friendly smile, and said she was absolutely right. I couldn't force her to do anything, but I could make her life in this town absolutely miserable if she chose to stay. I could make sure everyone knew exactly what she'd done. I could contact her professional licensing board with evidence of her affair with a client's family member, a clear ethical violation. I could contact her landlord, who happened to be a friend of my mother's, and share information that might make them reconsider her lease. I could file civil suits that would tie her up in court for years. I could make staying more painful than leaving. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. The defiance I'd seen in my bedroom that day was gone, replaced by something closer to fear. She realized, I think, that I wasn't the person she'd thought I was. I wasn't the naive cousin who could be manipulated and deceived indefinitely. I wasn't going to quietly disappear so she could have her happily ever after with James. I was someone who would fight back, who would use every resource at my disposal to protect myself and my children, who would make sure there were real consequences for what she'd done. She asked me if I really hated her that much. I told her I didn't hate her at all. I told her hate required caring, and I felt nothing for her anymore except a desire to never see her again. Rachel left that coffee shop, and 2 weeks later, I heard through family channels that she'd put her apartment up for lease and closed her therapy practice. A month after that, I heard she'd moved to Arizona, about as far from Ohio as you could get. while staying in the continental United States. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She didn't try to explain. She just left, which was the best decision she could have made for everyone involved. My children asked about her a few times, wondering why their godmother had suddenly disappeared from their lives. I told them she'd had to move for work, that sometimes adults have to make difficult choices, that they could reach out to her if they wanted, but I suspected she needed space to deal with some personal issues. Charlotte looked at me skeptically, clearly suspecting there was more to the story, but she didn't push. Oliver seemed to accept the explanation at face value. Kids see what they're ready to see. With Rachel gone, I could focus entirely on the divorce and the criminal case against James. The legal proceedings moved slowly, as they always do. James hired his own lawyer, a man who seemed to specialize in making excuses for his client's behavior. They argued that the affair was a personal matter that had no bearing on the financial settlement. They argued that the credit card fraud was a misunderstanding, that James had intended to pay everything back, that he'd never meant to permanently deprive me of anything. They argued that James deserved joint custody of our adult children, as if custody was even an issue when both Charlotte and Oliver were old enough to decide for themselves who they wanted to have relationships with. Patricia was relentless in her response. She presented evidence of the affair in excruciating detail, documented every lie James had told, demonstrated a pattern of deception that had lasted years. She showed that the $40,000 James had given Rachel had come from accounts I'd contributed to, from the joint earnings of our marriage, money that should have been used for our family's benefit, rather than funding his affair. She presented the fraudulent credit card applications with my forged signature, making it clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding but deliberate criminal behavior. And she argued that James had demonstrated such a fundamental lack of character and judgment that I deserved the maximum possible settlement to compensate for the financial and emotional damage he'd caused. The divorce proceedings took 8 months. 8 months of lawyers and depositions and court appearances. 8 months of seeing James across conference room tables and courtrooms, watching him try to present himself as a good man who'd made mistakes, rather than someone who'd systematically betrayed and stolen from his wife for years. 8 months of having our private life examined and discussed and judged by strangers. 8 months of my children watching their parents destroy what was left of our family in the most public possible way. It was exhausting and painful and humiliating, but I never wavered. I never considered settling for less than I deserved. I never let James or his lawyer make me feel guilty for pursuing justice. The settlement, when it finally came, was everything Patricia had hoped for. I received the house, 75% of our retirement accounts, full control of the college funds we'd set up for Charlotte and Oliver, and a portion of James's pension when he eventually retired. James was ordered to pay back the $40,000 he'd given Rachel, plus the $25,000 in fraudulent credit card charges, with interest. The criminal charges were reduced to a misdemeanor as part of a plea deal, meaning James would face probation and mandatory restitution, but no jail time. His bank, once they learned about the criminal charges, opened an internal investigation that resulted in James being quietly let go from his position. After 26 years with the same employer, he was suddenly unemployed at age 54 with a criminal record and a reputation that made finding another position in banking nearly impossible. James showed up to court every day with his lawyer, but Rachel was never there. I learned later that James had tried to contact her after she moved to Arizona, had called and texted and emailed trying to maintain their relationship, even as everything fell apart. But Rachel had stopped responding. Once the fantasy of their relationship became complicated by reality, once there were consequence and complications and public knowledge of what they'd done, Rachel had lost interest. But she hadn't wanted James when he came with baggage and legal troubles and an ex-wife who was making their lives difficult. She'd wanted the fantasy, the forbidden romance, the idea of reclaiming her first love. But the reality of actually being with James, of dealing with the aftermath of their choices, of building a real relationship instead of sneaking around, that apparently wasn't as appealing. I took a certain bitter satisfaction in learning this. James had thrown away 24 years of marriage, destroyed his relationship with his children, lost his job, faced criminal charges, all for a woman who'd ultimately decided he wasn't worth the trouble. He'd believed Rachel when she'd said she'd been waiting for him all these years, that their love was destiny, that they were meant to be together. But it turned out Rachel had been in love with the idea of James, with the fantasy of the life they might have had, not with the actual complicated reality of who James was. Once the affair was exposed, once she had to face consequences for her actions. Once staying with James meant dealing with legal troubles and financial problems and his angry ex-wife, she decided her great love story wasn't worth living after all. James tried to reach out to me several times during this period, wanting to talk, wanting to explain, wanting I don't even know what. Forgiveness, maybe, understanding, some kind of absolution that would make him feel less like the villain of his own story. I refused every attempt at communication that wasn't mediated by our lawyers. I had nothing to say to him, no interest in his explanations or his regrets or his attempts to rewrite history. He'd made his choices. He could live with the consequences. My only concern was protecting myself and my children and building a new life that didn't include him, except in the most minimal necessary ways. My relationship with the rest of my family was more complicated to navigate. I was angry at all of them for keeping James and Rachel's history from me, for participating in the deception that had allowed this betrayal to happen. But I also understood, on some level, that they genuinely believed they were protecting me. My parents especially were devastated by what had happened, guilty about their role in keeping secrets, horrified by what Rachel had done after they'd taken her in and treated her like their own daughter. My mother cried when she tried to apologize to me, saying she'd never imagined that keeping that old secret would lead to something like this, that if she'd known what would happen, she would have told me everything from the beginning. I couldn't entirely forgive them, but I also couldn't cut them out of my life completely. They were still my parents. Nathan was still my brother. Grace was still my sister. They hadn't betrayed me deliberately. They'd made what they thought was a caring decision that had terrible unintended consequences. So I did what felt necessary for my own healing. I told them I needed space and time before I could have a normal relationship with them again. I told them I needed them to understand that their decision to keep secrets had fundamentally damaged my ability to trust them. I told them that rebuilding our relationship would take years and would require them to be completely honest with me going forward, even when the truth was uncomfortable or difficult. They all agreed. They all promised to do better. Whether they would actually follow through remained to be seen. The person in my family I ended up closest to during this period was actually Charlotte. My daughter had watched everything unfold, had seen her father's betrayal and the family's complicity in keeping secrets, and had processed it all with a maturity that amazed me. She told me one night that finding out about the affair had actually explained things that had confused her for years. She said she'd always felt like there was something strange about the dynamic between James and Rachel, some tension or connection she couldn't quite name. But she said she caught them looking at each other in ways that didn't make sense, having conversations that seemed too intimate for cousins by marriage, being too familiar in ways that had made her vaguely uncomfortable without understanding why. Charlotte told me she'd even confronted Rachel about it once, about 6 months before I caught them together. She'd noticed Rachel leaving our house late one night when Charlotte had come home unexpectedly from college. Rachel had claimed she'd just stopped by to borrow something, but Charlotte had seen James's truck in the driveway and had wondered why her father was home when he'd told me he was working late. She'd asked Rachel if something was going on between her and James. Rachel had laughed it off, had told Charlotte she was imagining things. Had made Charlotte feel foolish for even suggesting such a thing. But Charlotte had known something wasn't right. She'd just been too afraid to push further, too afraid of what she might uncover if she kept asking questions. Hearing this broke my heart in a new way. My daughter had been carrying suspicions and concerns about her own father's behavior, had been manipulated by Rachel into doubting her own perceptions, had been forced to hold uncomfortable knowledge without knowing what to do with it. I apologized to Charlotte for not seeing what was happening sooner, for not protecting her from having to carry those suspicions alone. She told me it wasn't my fault, that no one could have known what James and Rachel were hiding, that they'd been very careful to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But I still felt like I'd failed her somehow, like a better mother would have noticed her daughter's discomfort and investigated instead of being oblivious. Oliver's reaction to everything was different. He was angry, especially at James, angry in the way that young men get when their fathers disappoint them. He stopped taking James's calls. He refused to see him even when James showed up at the house begging to talk. He told me he felt betrayed not just by the affair, but by all the lies, all the times James had claimed to be somewhere he wasn't, all the family dinners where James had sat there pretending everything was normal while conducting a secret relationship. Oliver said he didn't know if he'd ever be able to forgive James, and I told him that was his choice to make, that I wouldn't push him to have a relationship with his father if he didn't want one. But I also told Oliver something important. I told him that while James had been a terrible husband, he hadn't always been a terrible father. Before the affair, James had been present for Oliver's childhood, had coached his soccer team, had helped with homework, had been there for school events and family vacations and all the normal rhythms of parenting. The affair didn't erase those years or make those memories invalid. James's betrayal of me didn't necessarily mean he couldn't still have a relationship with his son, if both of them were willing to work toward that. Oliver listened but didn't commit to anything. He said he needed time, that maybe someday he'd be ready to talk to James again, but not now. I respected that. Healing happens on its own timeline. As the divorce was being finalized and life was slowly returning to something resembling normal, I started thinking about what came next. I'd spent 24 years being James's wife, being the mother of James's children, building a life that was fundamentally intertwined with his. Now I needed to figure out who Emily Thompson was without that identity, what my life looked like when it was just mine to shape. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I was 52 years old, starting over in ways I'd never imagined I'd have to start over. But I was also free in ways I'd never been free before. Free to make choices based entirely on what I wanted rather than on what was good for my marriage or my family. I decided not to go back to teaching, at least not right away. The school had been understanding about my leave of absence, but I realized during those months away that I wasn't sure I wanted to return to the classroom. I'd been teaching for 24 years, the entire length of my marriage, and the job had become tied up with my identity as James's wife in ways that made it feel like part of my old life rather than part of my future. So I took an early retirement package the school district offered, cashed out my pension at a slight penalty, and decided to use that money plus the divorce settlement to do something I'd always dreamed about, but never had the courage to pursue. I started writing. I'd always loved writing, had filled journals throughout my marriage with thoughts and observations, and stories I'd never shared with anyone. Now I decided to turn those private writings into something public. I started a blog about rebuilding life after betrayal, about navigating divorce, about finding yourself again after losing everything you thought your life was supposed to be. I wrote honestly about the affair, about my family's lies, about the legal proceedings and the emotional devastation, and the slow, painful process of healing. I wrote about anger and forgiveness and grief and hope. I wrote because I needed to process what had happened to me. And I wrote because I suspected there were other women out there going through similar experiences who might benefit from knowing they weren't alone. The blog took off in ways I never expected. Women from all over the country started reading and commenting, sharing their own stories of betrayal and recovery, offering support and advice and connection. I heard from women who'd been cheated on by husbands, with their sisters, their best friends, their co-workers, their neighbors. I heard from women whose entire families had lied to them about their husbands' affairs, who discovered that everyone around them had been keeping secrets. I heard from women who'd found out their marriages were built on foundations of deception, who'd discovered that the lives they thought they were living were completely different from reality. My story resonated because it wasn't unique. Betrayal and family dysfunction, and the particular pain of being deceived by people you trust completely. These are unfortunately common experiences, and women were hungry to hear someone talk honestly about them. After 6 months of blogging, I was approached by a literary agent who'd been following my writing. She suggested I turn the blog into a book, a memoir about my experience combined with practical advice for women going through similar situations. The idea terrified me. Writing on a blog felt relatively anonymous, safe, contained. Writing a book felt like exposing myself in ways that would be permanent and public and impossible to take back. But it also felt like an opportunity to take something painful and transform it into something useful to help other women navigate the financial and emotional complexities of divorce after infidelity in ways I'd had to figure out on my own. I wrote the book over the course of a year. I wrote about my marriage, about the affair, about the discovery and the aftermath and the legal proceedings. I wrote about the money James had stolen and how I documented it and used it to build my case. So I wrote about the credit card fraud and the criminal charges and the importance of protecting your financial interests, even when you want to believe your spouse would never hurt you. I wrote about family dynamics and secrets and the ways that well-meaning people can enable terrible behavior by keeping quiet. I wrote about Rachel and about trying to understand how someone I'd loved so deeply could betray me so completely. I wrote about my children and about protecting them, while also being honest with them about difficult realities. I wrote about the slow process of rebuilding trust in myself and in others after having my ability to judge character and perceive reality so thoroughly shattered. The book was published 18 months after my divorce was finalized. I used a pseudonym, changed names, and identifying details. It protected everyone's privacy while still telling the truth of what had happened. The book sold well, better than my publisher had expected. It hit bestseller lists. I was invited to speak at women's groups and book clubs and divorce support groups. I appeared on podcasts and morning shows and news programs. My story, the story I'd been living through with such pain and confusion and anger, became something that helped other people. It became something valuable and meaningful beyond just the personal devastation I'd experienced. And somewhere in the process of writing that book and sharing that story and connecting with women who'd been through similar experiences, I started to heal. Not completely. Not in a way that erased what had happened or made the betrayal okay, but in a way that let me move forward, that let me build a new identity that wasn't defined by what had been done to me, but by how I'd responded to it. I was no longer just James's ex-wife or the woman who'd been betrayed by her cousin. I was Emily Thompson, author and advocate and survivor. I was someone who'd been knocked down and had gotten back up. I was someone who'd been lied to and had chosen to live in truth. I was someone who'd lost everything and had built something new from the wreckage. But even as I was healing and building this new life, there were still unanswered questions that nagged at me. Questions about Rachel specifically, about who she really was beyond the version of her I'd known. Because the more distance I got from the affair, the more I thought about her behavior throughout our lives, the more I started to see patterns I'd missed when I was too close to the situation. Rachel's 2 failed marriages that had both ended in affairs, her therapy practice that had struggled despite her clinical skills, her intense focus on me and my life, always being around, always being involved, always needing something, her dramatic reaction to James's teenage breakup that had resulted in hospitalization, the way she'd orchestrated our meeting at my birthday party, the 3-year affair conducted with such calculation and planning. None of it painted a picture of someone who'd simply made a mistake or fallen into temptation. It painted a picture of someone with deeper issues, someone whose behavior followed patterns that suggested something more than just unrequited love. I started doing research, out talking to people who'd known Rachel at different points in her life, trying to understand who she really was. I reached out to her first husband, William, the high school teacher she'd been married to for 3 years. We met for coffee, and William told me things about Rachel that shocked me. He said she'd been obsessed with him before they'd even started dating, that she'd engineered situations to run into him, that she'd studied his interests and preferences and shaped herself to match what he wanted. He said the marriage had been intense at first, passionate and all-consuming, but that Rachel had become increasingly controlling and possessive as time went on. She'd wanted to know where he was every minute, had accused him of being interested in other women when he spoke to female colleagues. He had isolated him from friends and family, who she claimed didn't understand their relationship. Williams said he'd found the text messages that revealed Rachel's affair entirely by accident, but that when he'd confronted her, she'd shown no remorse. She'd told him the affair had happened because he hadn't been giving her enough attention, because he'd been putting his job ahead of their relationship, because she'd needed to feel desired and wanted in ways he wasn't providing. She'd turned her own infidelity into his failure, had made him feel guilty for her choice to betray him. It had taken William years of therapy after the divorce to understand that Rachel's behavior patterns were consistent with certain personality disorders, that her inability to take responsibility for her actions and her tendency to blame others for her choices were signs of deeper psychological issues. I tracked down Benjamin, Rachel's second husband, the contractor she'd been married to for 18 months. His story was eerily similar. He said Rachel had pursued him aggressively, had been everything he wanted in a partner at first, had seemed perfect in ways that should have been a red flag, but that he'd interpreted as fate. But after they married, she'd become demanding and unpredictable. She'd needed constant reassurance and attention. She'd created drama where there wasn't any, picking fights over small things, accusing him of not loving her enough or not prioritizing her needs. When he'd caught her in bed with his business partner, she'd blamed him for working too much, or for not being emotionally available, for forcing her to seek connection elsewhere. She'd made her affair his fault. Talking to William and Benjamin, I started to see Rachel in a completely different light. The woman I'd thought I knew, my beloved cousin who'd had a hard childhood and struggled with relationships but was fundamentally good and caring, that woman might never have existed. Instead, Rachel appeared to be someone who was deeply damaged in ways that manifested as manipulation and deception and an inability to maintain healthy relationships. She was someone who pursued what she wanted with single-minded focus, who shaped herself to match what others needed, who created intense connections that felt meaningful, but were actually performances designed to get her what she wanted. And what Rachel had wanted, I now realized, was to win. Not to have James specifically, but to win the competition she'd created in her mind, where I was her rival and James was the prize. She'd spent decades building a relationship with me, becoming indispensable in my life, earning my trust and my love, all while resenting me for having what she believed should have been hers. The affair wasn't about loving James. It was about taking him from me, about proving that she could, about evening a score that existed only in her own mind. I'd been living my life while Rachel had been playing a completely different game, one where every kind thing I did for her, every way I helped her, every moment of our friendship had been fuel for her resentment, rather than reasons to value our relationship. This realization was almost as devastating as discovering the affair itself. And because it meant our entire relationship had been a lie. Rachel had never really been my friend. She'd never really cared about me. I'd been nothing more than an obstacle between her and something she wanted, and she'd spent decades positioning herself to take it. Every memory I had of our friendship, every moment of closeness and connection, was now tainted by the knowledge that Rachel had never been who I thought she was. The woman I'd loved like a sister, had grieved with and laughed with and shared my life with, had been a carefully constructed fiction designed to serve Rachel's purposes. I wanted answers. I wanted to confront Rachel with what I'd learned, to ask her directly if any of our friendship had been real, or if it had all been part of some long game she'd been playing since we were children. But Rachel had disappeared completely after moving to Arizona. She'd blocked me on social media, changed her phone number, made herself unreachable. I hired a private investigator to find her, and what he discovered was both shocking and somehow not surprising at all. Rachel had moved to Phoenix and within 3 months had started a relationship with another married man, a wealthy businessman who was in the process of divorcing his wife. She'd met him at a grief support group, of all places, where she'd apparently been attending meetings and presenting herself as a widow grieving the loss of her husband, even though she'd never been widowed and had in fact been divorced twice. She'd told this man that her husband had died in a car accident, that she was struggling to rebuild her life, that she was lonely and vulnerable and looking for someone who could understand her pain. The man had fallen for her story, had started an affair with her while still technically married, was apparently planning to marry Rachel once his divorce was finalized. The investigator also found out that Rachel had lied about her hospitalization after James broke up with her in high school. She hadn't attempted suicide, as everyone had been told. She'd been hospitalized for a psychotic break, for stalking James after the breakup, for showing up at his college campus repeatedly, despite him telling her to stay away, for behavior that his parents had deemed threatening enough to seek a restraining order. My Aunt Margaret, Rachel's mother, had lied to everyone about what happened. Barr had said it was a suicide attempt, rather than admit her daughter had been institutionalized for frightening behavior. And our family, wanting to support Margaret and protect Rachel, had accepted the lie and built their own lies on top of it. This information changed everything I thought I knew about my life. James hadn't broken Rachel. Rachel had been broken long before James, probably by her childhood trauma of abandonment by her father and neglect by her depressed mother, probably by personality patterns that were established early and that had only gotten worse over time. The affair with James wasn't about true love or second chances. It was about Rachel following patterns she'd been following her entire life. Patterns of obsession and manipulation and boundary violation. I'd been targeted not because I was special, but because I happened to be in Rachel's orbit when she decided to act on her obsession with reclaiming James. Any of her relationships, any of the people in her life, could have become targets of her manipulation if they'd had something she wanted. Knowing all this should have made me feel better somehow. It should have helped me understand that what happened wasn't really about me, that I couldn't have prevented it, that there was nothing I could have done differently that would have changed the outcome. But instead, it made me feel worse, because it meant my entire childhood and young adulthood had been spent in close relationship with someone dangerous, someone whose mental illness and personality disorders had put me at risk in ways no one had recognized or addressed. My family had known Rachel had serious problems. They'd known about the institutionalization, about the stalking behavior, about the lies. And instead of getting her real help or protecting me from potential harm, they'd covered it up and pretended everything was fine. They'd let Rachel into my life, into my home, into my children's lives, all while knowing she was capable of disturbing behavior when she didn't get what she wanted. I confronted my parents with what I'd learned. I showed them the investigator's report. I asked them directly if they'd known Rachel had been hospitalized for stalking James rather than for a suicide attempt. My mother broke down in tears. My father couldn't meet my eyes. They admitted they'd known. They admitted they'd agreed to lie about it because Margaret had begged them to, because Rachel's diagnosis and hospitalization would have stigmatized her for life, because they genuinely believed that with support and family love, Rachel could overcome her problems. They'd thought bringing Rachel into our home after Margaret died would give her the stability she needed to heal. They'd thought treating her like family would make her feel secure and valued and less likely to engage in the kind of obsessive behavior she'd shown with James. They'd thought they were helping. Instead, they'd given Rachel access to me, to my life, to information about me that she'd eventually weaponize. They'd helped create the conditions that allowed the affair to happen, not intentionally, not maliciously, but through a combination of misguided compassion and willful ignorance about the severity of Rachel's issues. My parents had wanted so badly to believe Rachel could be fixed with love that they'd ignored warning signs and red flags and clear evidence that she needed professional intervention rather than just family support. And in doing so, they'd put me in danger without my knowledge or consent. This betrayal by my parents felt different from their earlier betrayal of keeping James and Rachel's high school relationship secret. That had been misguided but understandable. This was something else. This was knowing their niece had serious mental health issues and personality disorders that made her potentially dangerous, and choosing to hide that information from me even as they brought her deeper into my life. This was prioritizing Rachel's privacy and Margaret's wishes over my safety. This was a fundamental failure of parenting, of protection, of the basic responsibility they owed me as their daughter. I told my parents I needed to take a break from our relationship. Not forever, not necessarily, but for a significant period of time, while I processed what they'd done and what it meant. I told them I couldn't trust them anymore, that every interaction with them was now colored by the knowledge that they'd kept such enormous secrets from me, that they'd prioritized other people's needs over my well-being. My mother begged me not to cut them off, said she couldn't bear to lose me over mistakes they'd made out of love. But I told her that intention doesn't erase impact, that loving someone doesn't excuse lying to them and putting them at risk. I needed space, and I needed them to respect that. So I took that space. I focused on my book promotion, on my speaking engagements, on building my new life. I spent time with Charlotte and Oliver, strengthening my relationships with my children now that we were navigating a new family dynamic. I started dating again, cautiously, slowly, with a much more critical eye toward red flags and warning signs than I'd ever had before. I went to therapy regularly to process the trauma of the affair and the layers of family betrayal that kept revealing themselves. I joined a support group for people who'd been betrayed by family members, and I found community there in ways I hadn't expected. And slowly, painfully, gradually, I started to rebuild. Not the life I'd had before, that life was gone forever, and honestly had never been real anyway. But a new life, one built on truth and awareness and clear boundaries. A life where I didn't ignore my instincts in service of keeping peace. A life where I demanded honesty from the people around me and was willing to walk away from relationships that required me to accept deception. A life that was authentically mine, rather than a role I was playing in someone else's story. James tried to reach out occasionally over the months and years that followed. He sent emails apologizing, asking if we could talk, saying he wanted to explain himself better. I never responded. There was nothing he could say that would change what happened or make it better. He'd made his choices. He was living with the consequences. And I had no interest in making him feel better about those consequences. Charlotte eventually rebuilt a limited relationship with her father, seeing him occasionally for lunch or coffee. And though she said things between them would never be what they were before. Oliver remained estranged from James, refusing contact, and I respected his choice without trying to influence it either way. Rachel, according to the last update I got from the investigator, married the businessman in Phoenix and was apparently living the wealthy lifestyle she'd always seemed to want. Whether that marriage would last or whether she'd eventually sabotage it the way she'd sabotaged everything else in her life, I didn't know and didn't care. She was no longer my problem. She was no longer in my life or my children's lives. She was just someone I used to know, someone who taught me painful lessons about trust and perception and the importance of believing people when they show you who they really are. As I moved into the third year after the divorce, I started to notice something interesting. I was happy. Not just okay or surviving or managing, but actually happy in ways I hadn't been in years, maybe in decades. I loved my work, speaking to women about recovery and resilience, writing about the messy, complicated reality of rebuilding after betrayal. I loved my relationship with my children, which had deepened and matured now that we were navigating life together as adults, rather than as parent and children in a traditional nuclear family. I loved my freedom, the ability to make choices based entirely on what I wanted, rather than on maintaining a marriage or keeping up appearances or managing other people's feelings. I'd lost so much: my marriage, my best friend, my extended family relationships, my trust in the people closest to me, my faith in my own judgment and perception, my sense that the world was a basically safe and fair place, where good people were rewarded and bad behavior was punished. I'd lost the life I'd spent 24 years building, the identity I'd constructed, the future I'd imagined. But in losing all of that, I'd gained something I'd never had before. I'd gained myself. The real me, not the version of me that existed to be James's wife or Rachel's cousin, or my family's peacemaker. The messy, complicated, imperfect, strong, resilient, authentic me. And that me, it turned out, was someone worth knowing. Someone who could survive the worst betrayal imaginable and come out the other side still capable of love and trust and hope. Someone who could take pain and transform it into purpose. Someone who could look at the wreckage of her old life and build something new and better from the pieces. I wouldn't have chosen this path. I wouldn't wish what happened to me on anyone. But I also wouldn't trade who I've become for who I was before, living in comfortable ignorance, trusting people who didn't deserve trust, accepting a mediocre marriage because I thought that's just what marriage becomes. Now I know better. I know that trust should be earned, not given freely. I know that people who keep secrets are telling you something important about their character. I know that when someone shows you who they are through their actions, you should believe them regardless of what they say. I know that family loyalty isn't worth maintaining when it requires you to accept betrayal or deception. I know that sometimes the hardest and bravest thing you can do is walk away from relationships and situations that don't serve you, even when those relationships have been part of your identity for your entire life. I know that healing isn't linear, that some days you're fine and other days you're devastated all over again, and that both experiences are valid and part of the process. I know that you can survive things you never thought you could survive. That's probably the most important thing I learned from all of this. When I first discovered the affair, when my world fell apart, I genuinely didn't know if I'd make it through. The pain was so overwhelming, so all-consuming, that I couldn't imagine a future where I'd feel normal again. But I did make it through. Day by day, sometimes minute by minute, I survived. And somewhere along the way, survival became rebuilding, and rebuilding became thriving. It happened so gradually I didn't even notice it until I looked back and realized how far I'd come. So if you're watching this and you see yourself in my story, if you've been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've discovered that your life isn't what you thought it was, if you're sitting in the wreckage wondering how you'll ever feel okay again, I want you to hear this. You will survive this. It doesn't feel like it right now, I know. The pain feels permanent, and the future feels impossible, and you can't imagine ever trusting anyone again, or feeling happy again, or being anything other than this broken person sitting in the ruins of your life. But that's not true. You will heal. You will rebuild. You will become someone stronger and wiser and more authentic than you were before all of this happened. It won't happen quickly. It won't happen easily. There will be setbacks and bad days and moments where you feel like you're right back at the beginning. But there will also be good days. Days where you realize hours have passed without thinking about the betrayal. Days where you laugh genuinely for the first time in months. Days where you look in the mirror and recognize yourself again. Those days will get more frequent. The pain will get less sharp. The future will start to look possible again. And you'll learn things you never wanted to learn, but that will serve you for the rest of your life. You'll learn that you're stronger than you knew. You'll learn that you don't need to stay in situations that hurt you just because leaving is hard. You'll learn that sometimes the people who are supposed to love and protect you will fail at that. And that doesn't mean you're unlovable or unworthy of protection. It means they're human and flawed and sometimes deeply broken in ways that have nothing to do with you. You'll learn to trust yourself again, to believe your own perceptions, to honor your instincts even when other people tell you you're wrong. You'll learn that your worth isn't determined by whether someone chooses to stay with you or leave you or betray you. Your worth is inherent, unchanging, not dependent on anyone else's recognition or validation. These lessons come at a terrible cost. I won't pretend otherwise, but they're real and valuable, and they'll reshape how you move through the world in ways that will ultimately serve you. You'll become someone who can't be easily deceived because you've learned to pay attention. You'll become someone who won't tolerate mistreatment because you've learned what that costs. You'll become someone who values truth and authenticity above comfort and peace because you've learned that comfort built on lies isn't really comfort at all. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you considered family? What red flags did you ignore because you trusted someone completely? If you could go back, what would you tell yourself? Leave a comment below. Your story might help someone else who's going through this right now. You might give someone the courage to leave a situation that's hurting them, or the hope that they can survive something they think will destroy them. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. And sharing it might be the thing that helps someone else take their first step toward healing. And if you think this story was shocking, wait until you hear about the woman who discovered her best friend had been living a double life for 15 years, using her identity to commit fraud while maintaining their friendship. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Hit that notification bell so you're alerted as soon as the video goes live. Because these stories, as painful as they are to hear and to tell, they're important. They remind us that we're not alone in our experiences of betrayal and survival. They teach us to pay attention, to trust our instincts, to believe people when they show us who they really are. They give us roadmaps for navigating situations we never wanted to find ourselves in, but that happened to good people every single day. Before I go, I want to leave you with one final thought. They say family is everything. But sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. And sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself. What happened to me destroyed the life I thought I had, but it also freed me to build the life I actually wanted, the life I deserved, the life where I wasn't constantly managing other people's lies, or ignoring my own perceptions, or settling for less than I was worth. I wouldn't wish this experience on anyone, but I also wouldn't trade who I am now for who I was before. The old Emily lived in comfortable ignorance, trusting blindly, accepting things that weren't acceptable because she didn't know any better. The new Emily lives in truth, trusts carefully, demands authenticity and honesty from the people in her life. The old Emily thought she was happy. The new Emily actually is happy, genuinely and deeply, and in ways that aren't dependent on anyone else's choices or actions. So if you're in the before stage right now, if you're just discovering the betrayal or just starting to process what happened to you, or just beginning to rebuild, I want you to know something. There's an after waiting for you. It's not the after you imagined when you thought your life would unfold according to plan. It's not the after where everything goes back to normal and you forget this ever happened. But it's an after where you're stronger, wiser, more authentic, more yourself than you've ever been. It's an after where you've survived the unsurvivable and come out the other side still capable of joy and trust and hope. It's an after that's worth fighting for, even when the fight feels impossible. And you deserve better than breadcrumbs of loyalty from people who should be giving you the whole loaf. You deserve honesty, respect, fidelity, genuine love from people who prove through their actions that they value you. You deserve to live in truth rather than in comfortable lies. And if the people in your life can't give you those things, if they continue to betray and deceive and ask you to accept unacceptable behavior, then you deserve to walk away and find people who will treat you the way you deserve to be treated. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to my story and for sharing your own stories in the comments. We're all in this together, all of us trying to navigate the complicated, messy reality of human relationships and betrayal and survival and healing. Your presence here, yet your willingness to engage with difficult topics, your openness to learning from other people's experiences, all of that matters. All of that contributes to a world where people can speak truth about hard things and find support and connection rather than judgment and isolation. Take care of yourselves. Trust your instincts. Demand honesty. Set boundaries. Walk away from situations and relationships that require you to diminish yourself or accept mistreatment. Build lives that reflect who you really are rather than who other people need you to be. And remember, you are stronger than you know, more resilient than you think, and absolutely capable of surviving whatever you're facing right now. I did. And if I can, so can you. Until next time, this is Emily Thompson reminding you that the truth might hurt, but lies hurt more. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is refuse to accept anything less than absolute honesty from the people who claim to care about you. Be well, be strong, and remember, you deserve better.